Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Here we are still in the Middle East trying to figure out whether or not there's ever going to be an end in sight on this global war on terrorism. Seems we've got many opinions about why we're over there in the first place, or for that matter for any other country when it comes down to it. Seems we have military bases in every far-flung corner of the universe when it comes to our planet, and we're always there because we want to keep peace. But is it really up to the United States to decide what peacekeeping actually means? We want to explore this today on our program by finding out what we can know about sort of the dangers, if you will, about how we decide that we're going to have this particular kind of police action happening all over the globe with U.S. foreign policy. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is the director of the Institute for Historical Review, which is an independent think tank and publishing educational center based in Southern California. He's also a historian, author, and lecturer, and he's joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today to talk about the future dangers of U.S. foreign policy. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program our guest, Mark Weber. Mark, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for having me on. It's a pleasure to be on with you.
You know, I've seen many documentaries when it comes to U.S. foreign relations, and it's always funny how our leaders seem to always say the same things when we go to war or set up a battle, and that is, we seek peace, which to me makes no sense whatsoever. How do you seek peace through war?
Right.
What is it with our country that's been like this for actually decades and decades and decades?
Yeah, well put. Gore Vidal had a book recently with the title Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, and that seems to be a problem in our country for a long time. Something really changed in the United States in 1898 when the United States went to war against Spain, and we've had a pattern ever since then of these kinds of wars in far corners of the world for reasons which are given that later turn out to be pretext, turned out to be pretty empty. In the case of Spain in 1898, which was a decisive year in which America made the transition from being a more isolationist or non-interventionist country to being an imperial power, the United States went to war against Spain supposedly to liberate Cuba, and because Spain had done the dastardly deed of blowing up a U.S. warship in Havana Harbor. Well, there's no evidence that Spain blew up the warship. It was probably a boiler that blew up. Spain didn't want war with the United States, but the United States acquired its first empire. It acquired Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Cuba as a kind of protectorate. And something then similarly happened in World War I, too. President Woodrow Wilson took America into war, telling the American people that this war would be the final war, the war to end all wars. That's what he called it, and the American people bought that. It was a war, as he said, to make the whole world safe for democracy. Well, a large reaction set in after that, but then we heard similar things told the American public in the 1930s and 40s in the run-up to World War II. And then again in Vietnam, we were given pretexts and reasons to go to war that turned out to really be pretty empty. And I think every American is pretty painfully conscious of the fact that George Bush got the American people, and the White House urged the American people into war against Iraq on the basis of claims that turned out to be untrue.
I know I was, I really enjoy watching documentaries to kind of find out, if you can, all aspects of a particular thing. And there was one out there called No End in Sight, which was about the war in Iraq. And I was astounded to see that here we set up our military in Iraq, and the Iraqi people seemed very happy, in fact, embraced the fact that our presence were there because they had felt protected. But then looting and crime and all kinds of other nasty things began to happen. And here our U.S. troops just stood there. There was no martial law called whatsoever. And now Iraq's were trying to figure out, okay, so what are you doing here? You just basically invaded our country. We've got all this nonsense going on. You're not doing anything. Get out. And you kind of wonder, what do we do, because it seems to me like we seem to be like a globally intrusive nation,
right.
And why things turned out that way.
Right. The United States and American leaders I think they're trying to uphold America's preeminent place in the world, a position that America has especially in the years after World War II, when after that conflict, America emerged as the one modern or industrialized country that hadn't been destroyed in the war. And so from 1945 up until the 80s or whatever, the United States was just unquestionably the number one military, economic, and financial power in the world. That's now changed a great deal. But in one area, the United States is still absolutely number one, and that's in the military. Mm-hmm. Something like half of the military spending in the entire world is by our government. And we have military bases, the Department of Defense even says, in 38 countries around the world. 716 military bases around the world. Now, in fact, the U.S. military presence seems to be even growing under the new president. This is all the more amazing because, especially for listeners that are over 50, we were told when we were younger that we had to have this huge military to defend against the Soviet Union because that was the big threat. Well, the Soviet Union is gone, and it seems like that what happened then is a new threat was developed, the so-called war against terror. Well, a war against terrorism is like a war against war. Terrorism is a means to an end. It's not a political or a military country or structure. It's an abstraction. And one of the problems, I think, is that Americans like to think that we carry out military actions because we're a good country, we're a good people. The problem with that, the big problem with that, is that if a country is going to war to fight evil, there's no end to the war. And the idea that we should try to transform other countries is illusory. But it's tied up, I think, with our view of ourselves as a country that is an exemplar, a model to the rest of the world. Well, something changed really dramatically in our history because our founding fathers didn't have that view. George Washington warned in his farewell address about the dangers of an imperial arrogance. Well, something went way off track from that, starting, as I was saying earlier, with the Spanish-American War, and now presidents and people talk about in this kind of morally messianic way about America's place in the world. And as I said, that's dangerous because there's no end to it. We'll be at war forever.
Is there going to be an end? Do you see anything ahead that shows that this pattern's going to change with American military intervention?
There's a huge danger here, I think, because the budget that is now in place and the projected military spending for the next several years is actually to increase our military spending. Just one example. We have military troops in Korea, Japan, many other countries in Asia, and when people are asked, well, what are we defending ourselves against? What's the danger? The number one country that's usually talked about is China. Well, the extraordinary thing is that we're borrowing hundreds of billions of dollars annually now from China to keep up this budget that we can't afford, supposedly, in part, to defend ourselves against the very country we're borrowing money from. This is really crazy.
I keep thinking of the analogy is I want to feel safe about my neighbors. What I'm going to do is I'm going to post somebody in their house with a gun, but then I'm going to ask that neighbor if I can borrow money to pay this guy to stand there in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, we should be very glad that China is no longer a communist country, that the Soviet Union is gone. And if there's any time when we could, and I think, reduce all of that, it's now and in recent years. The real danger here, I think, Daniel, is that not only can we not afford it, if we changing how we act militarily means a change, I think, in how we look at ourselves as a country. It means going back to the way we looked at ourselves as a country before 1898. And that will mean a very different change in how we look at ourselves and our place in the world, I think.
Mark Weber, can you give out a website people can find out more about this?
Yes, we have much more about this and other issues of war, conflict, propaganda, and so forth on our website at ihr.org.
Mark Weber, thank you for joining us on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you.